Okay, welcome everyone. We are really excited to welcome you to the Missouri River Bird Observatory's third annual Winter Learning Series. I'd really like to thank the folks that supported this series. The Conservation Federation of Missouri David Risberg Memorial Grant Program has funded this for the second year in a row. We've also received funding in the past from the Missouri Birding Society, as well as our wonderful supporters of MRBO. And I know that there are some of you on here tonight, and I just want to say that we are humbled and astonished by your support, particularly during the last month or so, and Como Gives for those of you that are in Central Missouri. So thank you so very much. A little bit of background for folks that are new to us. MRBO was founded in 2010. We have a home base and visitor center here in Arrow Rock, Missouri in Saline County that is near the Jameson Island unit of the Big Muddy National Wildlife Refuge. But we work all over the state of Missouri and at times in Kansas, Oklahoma, Arkansas. We are also part of several national coalitions that work in the conservation space. So really Missouri and beyond. A brief introduction of our staff. I'm Dana Ripper. This is Ethan Duke that's with us here tonight. We are the co-founders of MRBO. This is actually a picture at the River Center during an event that Zack hosted for Missouri Master Naturalists. So I thought that was a cool one to put in there. We don't do MRBO alone. These are our operations assistant, Marley Malmberg, and our Kansas City community conservation educator, Tessa Pullman. Our outreach assistant, Isabel Guthrie, our bird-friendly communities coordinator, Kaylee Wolfel, and our plastic pollution education coordinator, Cam Gromack. We also have a really active board of directors and 15 to 20 or so volunteers that kind of help us keep the doors open in Arrow Rock and work on our Bird Safe Kansas City project and just kind of help us operate everything that we do as an organization. So our mission is the conservation of birds and really all wildlife and via science, education, and advocacy. And when we speak about science work, what that typically entails is covering thousands of acres of Missouri and surrounding states' most imperiled habitats and surveying birds there. I'd like to call on Ethan to chat a minute about that coverage and what that kind of looks like as far as acreage and work.
Yes. So I put a little link in the chat there that is like a progress report that we wrote to the Missouri Department of Conservation. But for our grassland survey work in particular, which is a lot of our science, since 2012, we surveyed about 164 sites across 5 states. So it's quite a bit of area. And we do line transect surveys, so our surveyors walk along these transects. They're usually about 400 meters, and we've surveyed over 2,000 of those, which is roughly like 462 miles. And these surveys have amassed a sample size of bird detections, really statistically robust one of over about 250,000 bird detections. And they're all spatially explicit. Like these birds are marked exactly where they're using the habitat. And so we survey usually every year about 80 sites are surveyed in that 2.5 month breeding window. And we get about 30,000 bird detections a year. So you can tell it's a lot of bird detections and a lot of effort goes out there. And yeah, that's just kind of the scope of our work. You can check out that progress report there. I'll put the link in.
Thanks, Eve. And the folks pictured there on the bottom right, Kendall, Josh, Krista, Tracy, and Matt, those were our 2024 breeding bird survey technicians on the Grasslands project. So once again, it takes a lot of different people working together to get all of this stuff done. MRBO also does more than 100 education events each year. I'm really happy to report. I think this is the first time that we've reported it to folks. In 2024, that number was 163. And I'm not really even sure how that happened, but I kept looking through our event log, and sure enough, we did over 160 education events as an organization last year. So pretty proud of that, and our staff particularly. So why do we do this? Well, this was sort of the beginning of it. As folks on here probably know, we are experiencing precipitous declines in many bird species and in other wildlife, native plants, our ecosystems as a whole. So this is really what motivates us. And as an organization, we work on some really pressing issues. So here are some of those. Habitat loss, of course, toxification of landscapes, climate change, and in terms of birds specifically, the direct anthropogenic causes of bird mortality. So what that looks like as far as like real specific topics are food systems, stopping the proliferation of plastic, reducing light pollution, trying to reduce bird mortality in the built environment via window strikes, encouraging native plant restoration, and hopefully getting folks from all walks of life all over the place involved in all of these things. Um, so I know that if you're on this, that you've probably seen this. Joe, thank you for your comment in the chat. These are the upcoming sessions of this. But I really wanted to try and give an introduction briefly and just tell you all why a bird observatory is interested in this wide variety of topics. So with that, it is our great pleasure to welcome Zack Miller. Zack is a terrestrial landscape ecologist currently serving as Preserve Engagement Manager with the Nature Conservancy in Missouri. In this role, Zack facilitates the strategic planning and implementation for TNC's Centers for Conservation Innovation to serve as Missouri hubs for conservation research, demonstration of best practices, education and professional training, and public outreach and awareness. Prior to TNC, Zack worked in science policy, helping Missouri lawmakers access and understand scientific research related to environment, agriculture, and natural resources. And he also served as a sustainable agriculture extensionist in the United States Peace Corps in Paraguay. He holds a PhD in biological sciences from the University of Missouri Columbia and a BA in sustainable agriculture from Truman State University. Zack resides along the Big Muddy in Wooldridge, Missouri, with his partner Aaron, their daughter Phoebe, who is 1 year and 9 months old, a couple of dogs, and a small herd of dairy goats. So I'm going to stop sharing, and Dr. Miller, please proceed, sir.
Thank you, Dana and Ethan. I am really delighted to be here with you guys and your audience today. And I don't think this has been mentioned yet, so Happy New Year to everyone. Hope it's a great and productive year for everyone on the call. So thank you all for attending today. I'm going to share with you a little bit of how I think about the world, how I think about land use, especially centered in the state of Missouri. But I think with some context and background that applies elsewhere across the Corn Belt or breadbasket of the United States. And then we will zoom into a project that I've been managing since I started at TNC about almost 2 years ago now. So towards restoration agriculture in Missouri, I really like this graphic. It's done by Savannah Institute. I think it shows kind of the vision that a restoration agriculture could look like in our state, being diversified across the vertical canopy layer, diversified across the landscape, and with different compositions of plants and animals across that landscape. So by the end of this talk, I hope to convince you all of this particular statement right here. That resilient and regenerative agroecological systems or agroecosystems are built on native perennial polycultures. This is a very jargony sentence, but we will dissect it throughout this talk. And if there are any questions about what it means at the end, we can dive into that. So first, my background in biology was centered on ecosystem services, and this is really how I see the landscape that we are in. Ecosystem services are basically what the natural world, what the living landscape provide to us for free. And as biologists, we have this broken up into 4 major categories. And the first of these is what we call supporting ecosystem services. These are things that really make life possible on the planet. Photosynthesis being important, the ability for decomposition to form soil that provides the basis for habitats to support all kinds of amazing biodiversity. Next is the provisioning. And so this is us taking water from the landscape, food and forestry products. So all of agriculture and the production of food would fit into the provisioning ecosystem service, as well as things like mining and extracting different plants and products for medicines. Next would be regulating. So this would be things, climate regulation, flood control, clean air and water, and then pollination. I spent 5 years in grad school studying the last one there, pollination. And I was really thinking critically about how pollination gets delivered across a landscape and how changes in temperature and precipitation and land use practices affect the delivery of that pollination across a landscape. And then lastly, one that I think often gets overlooked is what we would call cultural ecosystem services. So this would be the aesthetics of a landscape, our ability to recreate safely in that landscape, to be able to learn from that landscape and to have some sort of connection to the landscape. And so the way I see the world is that for any given chunk of property on planet Earth, of terrestrial property, that it should be able to provide us with each of these ecosystem services in a relatively balanced fashion. However, the plants and animals that provide all of those ecosystem services, as Ethan and Dana alluded to in the introduction, are facing some major declines. This is a report from WWF in last year showing that in the last 50 years, we have seen about a 3/4 loss in all of the wildlife on planet Earth. And so this is an estimate that was done by studying 5,000 different species across 40,000 different populations. And this should be terrifying to everybody because, as I mentioned, all of those ecosystem services that are really important for humans, they are underpinned by the living world. And if we have a 73% loss in total wildlife on the planet, let's dive into why we have that loss. This is a paper, this diagram is from a paper that was from Science Magazine a couple years ago, and it is a meta-analysis looking at all the drivers for biodiversity loss across the planet, looking at thousands of papers and studies of different populations across the planet and trying to assess what is driving the major losses. So over here on the left side, the size of the circle that you see corresponds to its importance as a driver for biodiversity loss. So you can see invasive alien species, non-native species that show up in different parts of the planet from being moved around by humans, has a much smaller impact than things like climate change, pollution, direct exploitation, and the biggest one being land and sea use change. If we look over here on the right, it has it broken down by different habitat types. So terrestrial ecosystems on the top, freshwater on the bottom right, and marine on the left. Today, we're going to be focused mainly on terrestrial ecosystems up here. And you can see that the prominent driver of biodiversity loss across the globe is due to land and sea use change. So, and although climate change is a very serious threat along with these other threats, the predominant one at this time is land use change. So let's look at how we use the land on planet Earth. We all learned very early on in school that the planet's covered in about 70% in oceans, only 30% in land. Next layer in, of that area that is in land, only about 76% of it is habitable. The other 10 to 24% is barren or in glaciers. So of that habitable land, we are allocating about 45% of the total habitable land on planet Earth to agriculture. And then the other big percentage is forest, shrublands, and although we think of urban environments as having a really big impact on the landscape, and they do in many ways, they make up only 1% of the total land area. So if we dive into the agriculture piece a little bit further, we see this piece right here is broken up by land that is allocated for the production of meat, dairy, and textiles on the left, and then for crops on the right side. And then interestingly, although we are allocating this big chunk for livestock, meat, dairy, textile production, it provides a much smaller percentage of the global calorie supply and global protein supply. This, of course, varies widely across the planet. This is a global average. So different areas of the planet would have different results. And we know as well that that those areas that are growing agriculture, they are trying to be as productive as possible, because that productivity and yield corresponds to a profit. And so they're taking those ecosystem services, potential ecosystem services that any chunk of land could get, and really squeezing them to maximize the provisioning ecosystem services, to be able to pull from the land as much yield of a particular crop as we can. And there's an ecological maxim which goes, there is no free lunch. So anytime we are pulling or pushing a landscape to give us something, it is going to have impacts that ripple and cascade throughout that landscape. And in this case, the pulling for the maximization of the provisioning services results in losses in other ecosystem services. So diving into Missouri, for those of you from Missouri or from the Midwest, these images on the right should look pretty familiar. Missouri has about 44 million acres in total. 27 million of that, about 60%, is in agriculture. And that is broken up roughly exactly 50-50, with crops making up about 13.5 million, and then grazing land making up the other 13.5. And a few things that I want to point out just looking at these images on our right. We have corn here, soybeans here, and then fescue on the bottom, fescue being important for raising animals and for producing hay. These top two images, there's something really unique about them that is very different than natural ecosystems, is that they are monocultures. Well, all three of them are monocultures. So as we look at this corn, soybean, and fescue landscape, there's not much else there. We can see far off in the distance some trees there, and there, but dominated by only one species. And if nowhere in nature do we see that. So this is a really unique thing that humans are doing, trying to grow just one species on a plot of land. And then these top two, one thing that makes them really interesting that differs drastically from natural areas and natural ecosystems is that they are made up of annual crops. So every single year we have to go in and plant a seed, and then wait 100 days or so, and then go in and pull off that seed, leaving the land bare after that. And these particular crops as well, corn and soybeans, are only growing for about 100 days roughly. There's different corn varieties and different soybean varieties that will vary from 60 to 100 days, but of the 365 days that are in a year, they're only growing on that land for a very short period of time. And so I think that it is really useful to think about a piece of land as, like, with all of the plants being basically solar panels. I mean, that we are trying to catch as much energy as we can from the sun in order to convert that energy into calories so that we can feed all of the humans on the planet. And this particular approach of just taking one crop, an annual crop that grows for only 1/3 of the length of the season, means that we're not catching as much of that sunlight as we could be catching, and converting that into nutrition for us to feed the planet. And especially whenever crops are really, really young, from germination up through the first month or 2 months of their life, there is not there's a lot of sunlight energy that is being lost at that herbaceous layer, with the sun going straight to the soil. And those monocultures, like I said, are very different from natural areas and natural ecosystems. We don't see that anywhere anywhere across the United States in Missouri where natural ecosystems are found. We don't see monocultures existing. And really, there's only one way to get a monoculture to work, and that is by using a lot of chemicals. So this slide I'm showing here shows the use of glyphosate, which is a common herbicide, basically so we can kill off all of the other plants that are trying to grow except for the one product that we want. And we can see, looking at this map, that from the early 1990s, there's a huge increase in the use of glyphosate. And glyphosate is, of course, only one of the chemicals that is used. It's an herbicide, so it doesn't account for other chemical fertilizers and nutrients and pesticides and fungicides that might also go across the landscape. But if we pay attention over here on the right side, this shows you similar information as the left, but in an aerial overview or a map. If we fast forward 30 years from, or about 40 years from 1992, that's what it looks like today. So we are seeing a huge increase in the amount of chemicals that we are pouring on a landscape in order to be able to grow that nutrition to feed our feed populations across the globe. And then it's important to note that this breadbasket where we're growing all the food in the country also happens to be the drainage for the Missouri River, which travels down Missouri, cuts across the state right here, and then out to the Gulf of Mexico. That river, which catches all of these chemicals, supplies about, I think, 40% of all of the drinking water in the state of Missouri. So we then, once we catch that water in Missouri, have to spend millions of dollars to pull all those chemicals out so that we can use that drinking water for our populations. And then beyond Missouri, once it heads down to the Gulf of Mexico, we know, I'm sure most people on the call have heard of dead zones. All of these chemicals that end up down in the Gulf of Mexico make it tough for anything down there to live. And so there is a dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. Most recent estimates say that it is the size of New Jersey. So for those who don't know their states, this one right up here, that is New Jersey. And if you put that right down here, estuaries where fresh water flows into marine ecosystems are normally some of the most productive habitats on the planet and most biodiverse habitats on the planet. But here, the size of, I think, 8,000 square miles, there's not much that can live there because of how we're producing our food. And what this looks like on a landscape is it makes it really challenging for animals to be able to navigate a landscape. This image is what is called a model from the patch corridor matrix model. And what that shows is basically the viable habitats for biodiversity are really relegated to small patches and then even smaller corridors between those patches. And those patches and corridors exist in this matrix, not with Keanu Reeves, but the matrix that would be what makes up the majority of the landscape. And in Missouri, that would be the farmland matrix, and then also urban matrix. And so imagine, if you will, how challenging that might be for an animal that needs to move to carry out its life history to be able to get across a landscape safely. I'm showing here just a little icon of the monarch butterfly. Some of you may know that the monarch butterfly is currently under consideration to be listed as an endangered species. This is one of the most fascinating and iconic insects on the planet that needs to be able to migrate across thousands of miles in order to carry out its life history. And it's pretty tough whenever you exist in a matrix that is inhospitable for you and your family. Showing here the major ecoregions that make Missouri, and that make the state really unique. So on the top part of the state is the central tallgrass prairie, dominated by herbaceous plants, so not many shrubs or trees up there. The west side of the state is the Osage Plains, a little bit drier, but also dominated by herbaceous plants. the largest blue that you see is the Ozarks, and then the bottom right, the other major ecoregion in the state is the Mississippi River alluvial floodplain. And these different ecoregions support all sorts of amazing habitats and all sorts of amazing biodiversity, and each of them is really unique. And each has a structure that is really, really unique. And by structure, I mean the kinds of vegetation that comprise the ecosystem that set the stage for the other kinds of biodiversity that can live there. And one thing that looks a lot different in these images than the ones we saw previously with corn, soybean, and fescue is there's a lot of diversity. That really stands out, is that plants of different shapes and sizes and different kinds of distributions across a landscape. And then the other item that stands out is that they are dominated by perennial plants. So we don't see that um, seeds need to be planted every year and cultivated every year and then harvested at the end of the year. We know that tall grass prairies that are dominated by perennial forbs and grasses have really deep roots, and they are growing year after year. The same with our forested and woodland and glade ecosystems that have perennial plants as the most important and most predominant component of those ecosystems. Really, across all natural ecosystems in Missouri, across the US and beyond, they're comprised of perennial plants. We see that time and time again because there's an advantage for perennial plants over annual plants. Where annuals become really important is after a disturbance. So imagine that there is a tornado or a wildfire or a big flood. The first plants that tend to move in are annuals. They will dominate for a few years, and then slowly the ecosystem will begin to be dominated again by perennial plants. If we think back to that 60% that's in agriculture, I really like this map. It's done by the Missouri Department of Conservation, which is on the bottom right there. And they took input from all of the partners that are working in conservation in Missouri and basically asked, where are your priority areas in the state? Where are the most special in terms of ecology and species richness and biodiversity? Where are the most important areas in the state of Missouri? And so this is a legendless map. I apologize for that. Red is what will be called a tier 1 natural community. Orange would be a tier 2, and then green would be a tier 3. And then what is not shown, those have the lowest level of biological importance. So if we think again about connecting those landscapes, I think that one of the most viable ways to do that is to pull perennials back into these ecosystems and do that through what is called agroforestry. Agroforestry is simply the intentional integration of trees and shrubs into cropping and livestock systems. And it is made up by these 5 practices: alley cropping, which would be think about like growing an orchard, but in addition to your rows of trees in your orchard, you have much more space in between them, so you can grow a second crop. We have windbreaks, so think about wind blowing hard across the landscape, and you can protect cattle and your crops if you put in rows of trees. Silvopasture would be the use of trees um, in animal systems. If you live in Missouri, you have most certainly driven by a field of cows that are all huddled up under one cedar tree trying to catch shade in the middle of summer. Trees can be really important for animal health, and both in terms of heat reduction, but also in terms of if you plant the right trees, they can drop food for your animals at times of the year when it's challenging to fatten them up. And then the next one, riparian buffers, would be putting trees and shrubs right at that land and water interface, allowing wildlife a corridor to travel along waterways, and also providing some benefits for filtering water and for protecting lands from damages that might come from floods. And then the last one would be forest farming, which is growing shade-tolerant medicinal and food plants in under tree cover in forests and woodlands. So this is what something like that might look at a landscape. Looks a lot different than the landscape that is dominated by annual crops. You can see alley cropping systems and forest farming down here, riparian buffers that go along the waterway, animal ecosystems that have trees in them, and then community food forests that are closer to urban areas. And productivity is, of course, very, very important. We are trying to generate calories to be able to feed people. And so I really like this schematic, which shows you on the left-hand side, on the y-axis, the productivity of a different kind of cropping system. And then on the bottom, we see the resilience of that system, or its ability to bounce back from a disturbance, as well as its ecological complexity. So we know that annual crops produce the largest amount of yield, but again, there is no free lunch, so that comes at a cost of having lower resilience to be able to bounce back from disturbances, and also has lower ecological complexity, meaning that there's not as much biodiversity that can be supported there. Following this curve down, we see orchard and then an alley cropping system. So orchard would just be really trying to get one tree crop. Alley cropping system would be trying to get one tree crop plus one or two others. And then a forest system down here on the bottom is the most resilient and ecologically complex, but has lower productivity. But we know from studying natural communities for a long time that there are ways that we can tinker with how we design a landscape, that we can design landscapes to try to find that sweet spot in the middle. We know that edge ecosystems, where one kind of ecosystem runs into another, are really some of the most biodiverse ecosystems across a landscape. And so we can design our food systems that way. And so this is a hypothetical diagram showing these different kinds of planting arrangements and multifunctional woody polycultures. So the multifunctional, that could mean that you're growing timber species as well as food species. The woody means that you're growing trees and shrubs. And then polyculture, that simply means that we're growing more than one thing. So we can design more complex landscapes that hit that sweet spot of providing us with some ecological resilience and complexity to support biodiversity and productivity. We also know that nuts and berries, these are often called superfoods, are really important for human diets and really important for human health. In Missouri, we happen to have some amazing perennial shrubs and trees that provide food products for us. So we see pecans and walnuts and chestnuts, elderberries, serviceberries, pawpaws, persimmons. And again, these are superfoods. We know that nut products provide us with high amounts of fats and proteins and omega oils that are really important. You can't go into a health food store without seeing an elderberry product. We know that they're really important, especially this time of year, especially if you have a 1-year-old and you're getting colds and flus all the time. Having elderberry products can help you kick some of that. And then pawpaws as another example. There's a bit of recent research coming out showing that there are anti-cancer properties, and recent research in elderberry showing that there are anti-Alzheimer's and anti-dementia properties in these foods. These foods are healing foods, and they are trying to grow like weeds across our landscape, but we tend to cut them all back so that we can grow these other 2 or 3 crops and really maximize that yield. But we have in Missouri a natural, nutritious, and botanical legacy that we could tap into to think about agriculture in a different way. And I want to shout out 2 different partners that I'm working with, and 2 different groups that are doing really exciting stuff in mid-Missouri. And one of those is One Health. And One Health is really thinking, small to read this text up here, but really thinking about how can we design a landscape to have healthy ecosystems that animals can live in, that we can get humans into safely, especially as a form of medicine. We know that immersion in nature is really beneficial for human health. And how can we grow food safely in an ecosystem? So really thinking about, from that ecosystem services bar chart that I showed you earlier, are there ways that we can intentionally, it's
Jesus. All right.
not a good call unless there's a technical glitch.
Glad you're back so quickly, though.
Okay, let's, sorry about that. I don't know what happened. The last point that I wanted to make with One Health was simply that I think that this is demonstrating on a landscape and pulling with partner groups that this is a potential way to design a landscape and organize partner groups to be able to balance out that delivery of ecosystem services across a landscape. And then I also want to shout out the Center for Agroforestry. We happen to have one of the world's leading institutions for agroforestry education, training, and research in mid-Missouri at the University of Missouri. I highly recommend you all check them out. And if anybody here is working in conservation, their flagship training program is called the Agroforestry Training Academy. And they just opened registration for that. So check it out on their website if you're interested in learning more about this. So what would it look like if we were really intentional about designing our landscapes and pulling in the benefits of riparian buffers, alley cropping, silvopasture, and trying to add elements of diversity to our ecosystem? Could it transform our ecosystem so that we get out of that dangerous matrix that is inhospitable, and then allow a more suitable matrix? Maybe not something that is prime habitat, but that at least it is safe for navigating animals and to be able to enter and exit. So could we take the state of Missouri and applying agroforestry principles to the right places, take it and turn it into something more like that, where these important areas of biodiversity are connected to each other through polyculture perennial systems? It might make it a bit easier for these guys to be able to navigate across the state. And I want to illustrate one more example here, which is this is some really cool old images from 1903. There's a major flood on the Missouri River in 1903. We're seeing here Kansas City, St. Louis. Check this out. There's some people like paddling a boat. That's pretty interesting. 1/3 of the way, this was one of the most damaging and biggest floods of record on the Missouri River. Widespread damages across the state, but at the same time, about 1/3 of the way through the state, this flood deposited pecan seeds, and those pecan seeds turned into mature trees that are still producing nuts 120 years later. So this is in Brunswick, Missouri. This is a pecan grove that was established during that 1903 flood, established naturally. So we didn't go out and plant these. And it has continued to provide food over the last 120 years, which is crazy. We see in the foreground here, this is what most of the agricultural systems in the Missouri River floodplain look like, which would be bare soils outside of that 100 days of the year whenever there are crops. And I think that if we are to I think the words resilient and regenerative are awfully watered down these days, and they are applied to things that are in fact not that resilient and regenerative. Something that is planted for free, that continues to provide food with very little inputs 120 years later, despite facing numerous massive floods in 52 and 67 and 93 and 2019, they're still producing food. That is resilient and regenerative agriculture. I will note it is very likely that these are progeny of pecan trees that were stewarded by indigenous people that we know were in this region prior to European colonization and moving across the US. And then I'll just note a fun anecdote is that the world's largest pecan is also in Brunswick, Missouri. So we have been trying to grow food for only about 10,000 years as humans in agriculture. And we've only been doing Western science for about 500 years or so, but there is about 4 billion years of natural intelligence baked into living systems on the planet. And those are, they're made up of systems that are resilient and are regenerative. The best examples, and really the only examples we have of true resilience and regeneration, come from natural systems. So how can we take those elements and apply them to how we design and use our lands in order to reap some of those benefits, and lessen and mitigate some of those consequences? So could we take those ecosystem services and apply some indigenous wisdom and Western science and squeeze out a little bit more of the provisioning services while still maintaining all of these other ecosystem services and making sure it's a safe space? I think so. And I'm going to share with you all a little bit about the Missouri River Center. This is a project that I've been managing for about the last 2 years with the Nature Conservancy, and it is very related to all the themes we've been talking about. And I hope we'll provide you all with some on the ground context for some of these kind of hypothetical and theoretical ideas. So going to do a site overview, spatial context, temporal context, then going into some detailed plans for the site. So first, spatial context. This is a 164-acre piece of property nestled right here in mid-Missouri. You can see the Missouri River is right here. This site is very unique because if we zoom out a little bit further, it sits in this mix of these other dark green areas, which are other protected areas. So we know that bottomlands and floodplains have some of the most fertile soils for the production of food, and that has resulted in the majority of it being used for those annual crops. And so there's very few sections of what we would call in the conservation world protected areas that are more biodiverse, that are more like conservation areas. And so this property sits alongside the about 5,000 acres of National Wildlife Refuge, the Big Muddy Refuge, just north of Eagle Bluffs Conservation Area and Marion Plowboy Bend, and then Marion Bottoms. So really unique because we're right next to all of our partners and in this really unique stretch of the river that is highly protected. We zoom out a little bit further, it looks like we're sitting right in the what we would call the Ozarks, but ecology nerds have subdivided it, and we're actually sitting in OZ15 alongside OZ12, which would be the Missouri River floodplain, and then what is called the outer Ozark border. So think about this, where the tallgrass prairies smash into the Ozarks and throw a big river system in there, and you have the bones for some really interesting ecosystems and really amazing biodiversity. We zoom out a little bit further. Again, this is the Missouri River watershed. So all the raindrops that fall anywhere inside these blue lines will make their way down and cross right in front of this property at the Missouri River Center before making their way to St. Louis and draining into the Mississippi River. This watershed catches about 1/5 of the area of the contiguous United States. So we have one of the most important and iconic and longest river systems right alongside this property. And then some temporal context. I'm gonna share a little bit more about this property in a reverse chronology, starting with this aerial image that Ethan took for me about a year ago, looking at the site. So I want to point out a few different things. This dark line that you see, this is a levee that cuts across the site. There's a boat ramp. This map is kind of tilted, so boat ramp down at the south side. Our whole north boundary is the Katy Trail, which some of you may be familiar with, and then the far north boundary and the south boundary are made up of 2 different small creeks. So we're going to step backward 22 to 23, and that's because Google Maps only updated one of their parcels and not the other. So 22, 23, and 22 is when this property was donated to the Nature Conservancy. If anybody wants to learn more about that, the website is down here, nature.org/Missouri. It's a cool backstory. Stepping backwards more, 2019, Boone County did LiDAR aerial imagery over the site, which helps to show the changes in elevation. So we see that darker yellow, that yellow line, that's that levee, so that'd be at higher elevation. The blue areas would be the drainage areas. So these areas right here, a little darker blue, hold water for more time of the year and are wetter than the other areas. And then the yellow up here drains, the whole site drains out this way. And this is the driest portion of the site up on the north side. The site has a nearly brand new restaurant on it. So TNC now owns a restaurant that we are trying to figure out what to do with. Over the last couple of years, we've used it to host a lot of partner meetings and connect people to the site and to develop our plans for the site. The restaurant was only operating for a few years before the donation was made. We step back a little bit further, we see the site looks pretty similar in 2012, still used for agriculture. We can see there's a tiny little tractor right there making lines. Site was in agricultural production before it was donated to us. You can still see the outline of the levee. There's a different building, which is the bait shop, which is a small store. And then there was an RV and camping area down here on the property. We'll step back a little further. Now in 1977, property looks pretty similar. Still have this kind of thick wooded riparian buffer here on the riverside, thicker on the north, and it thins out on the south. Most of the property is in agriculture still. If we step back to 1939, property looks a little bit different. Not many trees along the Missouri River, so we don't have much of that riparian buffer for supporting habitat for those benefits I described earlier. And the property looks a little bit different, and the river looks quite different, a bit more meandering, and looks like we don't have this chunk of land up here on the north that we do today. This is one of the coolest maps. This is a map of the property in 1900. So again, that north boundary is Terrapin Creek. And so that's right here. So the property lands right around here. The other drainage comes about right there. So property looks quite different then. You can see there's a huge sand deposition. The river looks a lot different. This would be before channelization. So the river would be wide and meandering and more shallow, and a really abraded network of waterways and wetlands and sandbars and channels. And one thing I like to point out is that if we travel along where the railroad is now and make a right up here, those of you who are in the mid-Missouri area, one of these little blobs, which represent vegetation, is likely the bur oak tree, the McBain bur oak, that is Missouri's state champion for the bur oak, 300 and something years old. So pretty cool that it is shown in this map. We'll step back a little bit further. This is a map that I got from one of Ethan and Dana's previous guests, Greg Olson. Hand-drawn map. What you see here, this long line is the Mississippi River. This line right here is the Missouri River. So that puts St. Louis right at the intersection of those two lines. If we head west from St. Louis, we would hit the Gasconade River on our left, the Osage River on our left, the Sheraton on our right, and the Grand River on our right. And this map shows where Iowa people lived. So the circles with dots in them, those were villages, and then the little dots connecting them, those were migration and travel patterns between the different villages. This map was drawn by a chief of Iowa people as colonizers were pushing west and trying to claim land. He was trying to stake claim to where his people lived across that landscape. Little circles up here that you see are the Great Lakes. This map here just shows overlapping polygons. It's a pretty cool resource that is available down here, nativeland.ca, showing you where different approximate boundaries of different indigenous groups across the world. So you can see the northwest area corner of Missouri here. If we follow the Mississippi, the southwest corner would be, or southeast corner would be down here. I mean, we know from lots of research and archaeology and historical records that indigenous groups, at least 12 different indigenous groups across 12,000 years were present across Missouri. And that really shaped the kinds of ecosystems that were here when colonizers were arriving. Here is another cool map that I like to show, which the little red or maroon dots that you see, these are burial mounds from indigenous groups across the middle United States. And one thing that stands out as being very, very obvious from this map is that they are clustered along rivers, because rivers are life-giving. Rivers provide us with drinking water. They provide us with really fertile soils, which we can use to grow food crops. They pull in wildlife that are accessing that water, so things like hunting and trapping become possible. And what was the last one? Really, really important areas, and you can see that people are clustered all along them. And I grew up about less than a mile away from the Mississippi, and then have lived a mile away from the Missouri. And it's not until the last few years that I've really had a relationship with the Missouri River and the Mississippi, because we tend to think of them in modern society as like how we get waste away, where it's the way that we can drain out all the things that we don't want. And so really thinking of them more these days as gutters rather than the things that draw us into to provide life for everyone. Thankfully, as colonizers were pushing west, they were noting the kinds of ecosystems that were here at that time. So they walked transects across the entire state of Missouri and noted the different ecosystem types that were found. And you can see that shown here. So that 160-acre property is this little orange outline. And you can see that it was made up primarily of woodland and forest. So that would be trees. And thanks to some cool research in 1970, or that came out in 1977, we have a good sense of how vegetation was at that time, and then how it changed over the subsequent, well, 150 to 200 years. So this looks at the changes in vegetation across that time in the Missouri River floodplain in Missouri. So we see, well, from Rulo, Nebraska down to the Mississippi. They noted all of the different kinds of species that were there, which you can see here. Got pawpaws, sycamores, hackberries, etc. And then they also note the percentage composition that was in forest and woodland. And so if we zoom into our section of the river, which would be these kilometer markers right here, we can see that the floodplain along the Missouri River at this particular stretch, it was 94% in trees and woodland. So it looks a lot different today. If we put that on a map, so this shows from Northwest Missouri down to St. Louis, the percentage of land that is in these different practices. So colonizers had been here already and growing crops for 50 to 75 years. So almost 20% was already in cultivation. Almost 80% was in forested ecosystem. Now, if we jump forward 200 years, it looks a lot different. So now 80% of that land area is under cultivation for production. And so that means grown for only one crop, corn or soybeans usually. And that forested landscape, which we know indigenous people were living in for a long time and stewarding and growing things like pecans and walnuts and pawpaws, has dropped from almost 80% across the state down to it's less than 2% now. So all of that to provide you with some context for site plans on this particular property. This site, we want to get it back under tree cover, and we want to try to reconnect people to our natural resources. So TNC is really envisioning this particular property as a place where we can work with partners to collaborate and try to figure out how can we design landscapes that benefit production that provide a lot of calories and nutrition for humans, while also still providing a lot of habitat and alternative uses for those properties. So envisioning this site as a long-lasting anchor site for collaborative conservation. And with the mission to connect people and reconnect people to this natural resource, the Missouri River, and to rethink how we grow food in the floodplains. Are there other approaches that we could put into place that would set the stage for our successors to be inheriting a richer landscape? Some of the, I bet in every cabinet in the kitchen of everybody on this call, there is some olive oil, and old growth olive trees are some of the most iconic trees across the Mediterranean area. And are we thinking about our ecosystem? Are we thinking about growing the old growth kinds of trees that will be producing food for not just my daughter, who's 1.5 years old, but for her daughter and her daughter's daughter, pecans and other trees like those can live for 300 to 400 years. So can we use this particular site to be thinking about how we can benefit the generations that are coming after us, and along the way providing training and education opportunities? Realizing I'm at time. So doing some wetland restoration work on site, and then we're really thinking about this site as being an agroforestry training and demonstration site. So how can we get these practices on the ground to be able to pull people in to see what works and what doesn't work? And how can we be the ones to do that work so that we can figure out, so we can fail first and provide some of that information to people after us. So we have plans on site for alley cropping, which I'll go over quickly. The north side of that property, we have 25 acres in pecans, 5 acres in walnuts, and we just sowed 30 acres in cover crops, winter cover crops. We're also doing some fun riparian buffer work to try to think about alternative ways to grow out a riparian buffer that people might be excited about. And we know that 93% of Missouri is privately held, so every inch that we take from agricultural production, it could be a loss in yield and profit for a farmer. So are there other ways to design multifunctional riparian buffers that offer different kinds of benefits? So we are breaking up this riparian buffer into 5 different blocks with different species compositions, all from the greater Missouri River watershed, but in different combinations that might be able to offer different kinds of benefits to landowners. So the first one, just go through these quickly, is what referring to as a honey flow riparian buffer. So this would be trees and shrubs that have long-lasting blooms that are really important for all pollinators, especially important for if one was trying to maximize their honey production in an apiary. Having these sorts of species that are flowering across the season and producing high nectar flows would be really important. The next one would be timber. We know that there are hardwood species, high value hardwood species that grow in these ecosystems. So can we be thinking about growing out a riparian buffer that our kids and grandkids can be harvesting, selectively harvesting for some added revenue? Next would be pioneers. So this is the fast growing species in the Missouri River floodplain that are the first ones to come back after a big disturbance. So willows, cottonwoods, sycamores. Next would be subsistence. So not growing food for production, but really to offset your grocery bill, which groceries are getting very, very expensive these days. So thinking about ways to defray those expenses could be really interesting to landowners. Next is big game hunter. So are there ways that can think about growing out a leasable hunting area for farmers? We have some plans for silvopasture on site in these chunks of the property. And we're really thinking about really that being a grass dominated savanna. So fewer trees, more herbaceous plants, and then running animals through this site with virtual fencing, and then planting species like mulberries and persimmons and oaks and hickories that drop calories at the end of the year or in the fall to be able to provide some added nutrition for your animals. So that's what it looks like all together. And then want to give a shout out to NRCS for any landowner in the state. There is a lot of support out there. If you wanted to do this kind of work, there's cost share available for every one of these practices. We're really trying to get these practices on the ground to be able to show our partners in conservation and agriculture and general landowners and farmers some ways that they could get some cost share to do this work on their own property. And so here's what we just got done doing. We just broke ground on this site about 2 months ago. So we planted this north 30 acres as well as got started on 2 of those riparian buffer blocks. Here's a view from the north end of the property looking south. Every one of those little white sticks you see is a tree that is planted. We hired a new outfit out of Missouri, Stacked Agroforestry, founded by these 2 gentlemen. Who are working to try to get more trees and shrubs across agricultural lands in our state. Here's some of the education that we were doing for those plantings. And then just for those of you who are interested in the process side of this, how do you go from a fallow farm field to something that looks like an agroforestry system? So the process that we followed is we burned the whole site first. We then went in and sowed those cover crop seeds, and in a couple spots also sowed some native wildflowers. Then cut a grid line using a subsoiler on a tractor with all the shanks removed except for one, and cut long lines and then cut perpendicular lines. And at every intersection, we pre-drilled holes with an 18-inch auger where every single tree would go, repurposed an old CAFO grain distributing dispenser to be a dispenser for mulch, and watered in trees with river water, and acquired trees from Forest Healing Nursery. And then we had a series of big community planting days, and over 4 days we got about 2,000 trees in the ground with the help of Stacked Agroforestry and about 100 volunteers and many hundreds of hours of labor. So a quick aerial overview. This is the riparian buffer that you saw on the south side of the property. Pretty cool. So a couple of things I want to note. We are designing this site for training and education and for getting people out onto the site to be able to see these things. So we're currently pursuing some cost share to get a public trail on the site. It will go along the levee, a boardwalk over the wetland area, and having a learning pavilion for some of the educational programs that Missouri River Relief is interested in running on the site. They're one of our key partners in this project. Didn't go into too much of the detail of the kind of work that they do, but amazing partners focused on reconnecting people to this natural resource. And then along the way, we are doing inventorying and monitoring work. I ran acoustic monitors on site for the whole season this year from April to October, capturing bird and bat diversity. We are doing soil sampling on site to be able to track long-term changes in things like soil biodiversity and soil carbon, and then also flora surveys on site to know how changes in natural communities will happen over time. And then for anybody who's interested in agroforestry work, I just want to throw out here, there is cost share support available for you in these states. So QR code there if anybody wants to explore what those opportunities look like. And then also want to point out there is an upcoming symposium, the annual agroforestry symposium held by the University of Missouri Center for Agroforestry on January 30th, 2025. And this particular symposium is themed around thinking about our agricultural lands as the avenues for restoration on our landscapes. So if we've lost nearly 75% of our biodiversity, and we know that that is happening in agricultural lands, how can we rethink and redesign our agricultural lands to be the primary avenues for returning some of that biodiversity to our state and to our country? And I think that we can do that through bioregionalism, through thinking about each location across the US as being very unique, because it is, and each location across the world. I don't think that we should think of agriculture as the one size fits all and try to get corn, soybean, fescue to be planted throughout the entire world. We have a really amazing biodiversity that I pointed out earlier, that our natural, nutritious botanical legacy. We should lean into that, and we could be growing old growth pecan forests in the Missouri River floodplain. We could be growing chestnut trees that reconnect animals across the landscape. I've heard the anecdote that a squirrel previously could travel from Maine to Missouri on the boughs of chestnut branches. We're all lost by the chestnut blight, but we can, through agroforestry work, through crop selection and hybridization, we can grow chestnut trees now and get a lot of nutrition delivered to us without as much input. And so this particular symposium is trying to get all of our conservation partners together to think about how can we restore these landscapes through thoughtful and deliberate design of our natural resources. And I will be there hosting, I will be moderating a session, very excited about this, and I hope to see you all there as well. And I'm happy to take questions, and I apologize for going over time.
I think you're pretty much on time with the intro we had and
Okay,
everything.
yeah, maybe that's, I
You
got
are.
freaked out by that because I looked at my watch and I was like, oh no.
Oh no. I don't, so can you see the reactions, the emojis that are coming up the screen, Zach?
I do, yeah. Thank you
Good.
all.
Good.
Yeah, the one thing that I just want to add that I didn't add at the very end is we are currently tasking agriculture to deliver like yield, and I just think that we're thinking about it the wrong way, because we are not using the right word. I think the appropriate word is nutrition. We want to ask agriculture to grow nutrition for the planet, not just trying to maximize yield. Um, and so I wonder, is it possible that a future agriculture, I think this one that we are in right now has served us for the last 100 years. I don't know that it's going to serve us for the next 100 years or beyond. But can we ask of all of the farmers, partners, conservation professionals that are working in those scenes to be thinking about production collaboratively, so that the task isn't how many bushels of soybeans or corn can you generate, but can the Soybean Association partner with the Northern Nut Growers Association and, like, create challenges to grow nutrition, and like who can grow the most nutrition across a landscape and who can support the most biodiversity across a landscape. And I think all of the cost shares and incentives that we have that are supporting our agricultural system as it is, we can rework those to be able to incentivize collaboration across these different associations and organizations, and collaborations and incentives to deliver nutrition and biodiversity, which I think is what we need to help solve some of these major crises on the planet.
Awesome. Zach, are you able to access the Q&A? We've tackled a couple of the low-hanging pecans, but there's a pile of them in there.
I can.
There's some, and Zach, a couple of them are in relation to the opportunities that are upcoming that you had like QR codes and references to. And I think maybe the best thing to do is for you to get those to us, and we will send a follow-up email with all the linkage, unless you have the like actual links super handy right now.
Nope, sounds good. I can follow up.
Cool.
with those.
Awesome.
Okay. I would guess that farmers are concerned with making a profit. How can they be convinced that these new methods will improve their profitability? Of course. And I didn't go into didn't do a big deep dive on this. I think one of the main supporting your family is obviously very important. We all want to make more money and be able to do that. I would argue that modern agriculture is not that profitable. We're actually seeing a lot of people leave agriculture, and we're seeing a lot of consolidation that is pushing towards bigger and bigger agriculture that really requires inputs and subsidies and incentives in order to be able to continue to work and to continue to function. I also know that of the huge amounts of money that are floating around in the world, of the billions and billions of dollars going into philanthropy and going into trying to solve problems related to biodiversity and climate change, that a tiny fraction goes into our food systems. So I think it's 3 or 4% from all of the philanthropy in the world goes to conservation. Only 3% of all of the funding that is for climate mitigation is going to food systems. And of course, our landscapes are very related. And I think that making the case that it is not a food system over here and a conservation area over here, in fact, that it is one living landscape that we are all a part of, I think making the ties that pull in that one health component, the human health component, the conservation side, the food production side. I think thinking about our landscapes holistically to support all of those ecosystem services is imperative. And there is a huge role for policy to make changes. So that's like the top-down approach. And there is a lot of need for the bottom-up approach, which is like having those scrappy, innovative farmers trying to figure out what is most profitable and what isn't, being able to have a network of demonstration sites, of which TNC is building one in mid-Missouri right now, to see what some different kinds of plantings could look like on a property. And then tasking conservation professionals, agriculture professionals, academics with creating the appropriate incentives that really support that industry. Sorry, that was since you're going for plant diversity, why are you planting a monoculture orchard of pecans? So thanks for that question. We are planting a diversity of trees across that site. Planted a few dozen different species in the planting that we just did. The reason that we have 25 acres in pecans is because we know that those are the most flood resilient of all the trees, and that those are in the wetter areas. So some non-flood resilient species or flood tolerant species like walnuts are a little less flood tolerant, and that's why we put them on the north 5 acres, which is the driest part of the property. And then I didn't get into our plans for underneath that canopy, but we are planning on growing native warm season and cool season grasses and running animals under those trees. So we will be pulling in diversity in the herbaceous layer, and then pecans will be a variety of different cultivars. Do you recommend introducing polycropping to existing hay farming? Absolutely. And the reason that we are going that like haying route or grass route, we know that from a lot of science that haying ground time after time, year after year, is really detrimental to soil health in the long term. And it takes a long time to be able to pull back onto that property the nutrients that you take from it in hay. If you do that in the bottomlands, then you will get periodic flushes of big nutrient dumps every time there is a big flood.
Zach, I
Yes.
think there's a couple that came in like while you had screen share up. Up at towards the very beginning, there's a couple questions such as how much of what Dr. Miller discussed is taught to future farmers in Missouri ag schools?
Great question. And we thought very critically about the audience for this particular project. that really shaped how we have designed this project and the kinds of partnerships we set up and plans moving forward. And that audience that we are really interested in is really the people who are working with farmers the most. So we are trying to target like groups like NRCS and academics and extension, people who work with landowners and farmers on the regular, and opening up this site to them to say, come learn from our mistakes and come learn from what we've put on the ground, to try to connect that back to farmers who might be interested. Although there is a bunch of money being thrown towards climate solutions like agroforestry, there's not a lot of expertise out there yet, and there's not a lot of demonstration out there yet. And so we are trying to help alleviate that bottleneck a little bit. Would like to apply this to an urban community center. What assistance? So I'll follow up with that. Zachary, the show me state, I think the fact you're on the correct model shows there. Yeah, working closely with NRCS leadership across the state on this project and beyond, and pursuing some cost share through EQIP, one of the environmental quality incentives program. And we are going down that route, one, because we are a nonprofit, so we have to really think hard about how to get money to put conservation practices on the ground, but also to show everybody who comes through that site, which is likely going to be thousands of people per year, given the partnerships that we have with River Relief, with the Center for Agroforestry, the proximity to Columbia, right on the Katy Trail. 300 to 400,000 people go down the Katy Trail every year. So we are planning to put in signage for all of the practices that we put on the ground, so that as people navigate that trail around the property, they can see, oh, this is EQIP practice 391, riparian buffer expansion, and they will know what that looks like 20 years later, and they will know how to be able to access that particular cost share.
Wonder when, Zach, I wonder when the Q&As start showing up for you. We've got some that came in at 6:51 all the way through. I don't know what the earliest one that's showing up in you after we came back on.
I see, well, I guess I'm seeing them still come in like 7:51, 7:49.
The earliest one would be,
So there's a question from Linda at 6:51. When you were speaking towards the beginning about crops in general, like I think it was around the time that you were saying that Missouri is 60% in crops. She says, does that include specialty crops, aka real food?
The 60% is agriculture in general, and then that's half and half in grazing systems and cropping systems. And I think it does, but that alternative, what would like fall in the alternative foods bucket, is like a paltry 1 to 2% of the total production. So it doesn't make up a large amount.
From 7:05, how are many producers using any of these agroforestry practices in Missouri right now?
Because of the Center for Agroforestry in Columbia, we do have growing adoption, and we have some of the older producers that have mature. I mean, of course, Missouri has a pecan industry. That's one of the most mature nut industries we have. Pecans, walnuts, and a growing chestnut industry. And for folks interested in this, I would highly encourage you to take the Agroforestry Academy that the University of Missouri offers. Really useful for learning about different cropping systems, but also really useful for being able to visit different farms and to talk with different producers. I recall a chestnut producer just like 40 minutes away from Columbia, and the photo of chestnut that I shared there at the end was from his farm, and he had a statement that was like, it doesn't matter what I price my chestnuts at, they are sold before they hit the ground. He's like, I started selling them at $3 a pound, and then went to 4, and then went to 6, and now I'm selling them at $9 a pound, and they're all sold before they even hit the ground. And so I think there is like a burgeoning industry. I think there's also a lot of opportunities. There's a lot of swirling parts that I think are incentivizing going towards agroforestry production. There are definitely mature agroforestry farms in Missouri, and more each year.
Okay, we might be back in convergence now.
Okay.
Do you see in terms of glyphosate use, is that your top question right now?
I see, yep, in terms of glyphosate use, the academic literature is wide. So you can get lost pretty quickly trying to understand the impacts of different agricultural chemicals on biodiversity. There are lots of research out there. I would pay attention to the meta-analyses and the reviews, which really try to lump all of those impacts. And I don't think I'm going to speak definitively about that without consulting them, but happy to speak up outside of this on that. How will shading of alley crop affect crop yield? Great question. It will, of course. Yeah, it's intercepting those light rays before they get to the ground layer. So it really depends. And that one schematic that I showed of the alley cropping system, the like hand-drawn one, it has it laid out really thinking about it like a successional ecosystem where you are starting out with very young trees and you're growing your annual crops or things like perennial crops like Kernza, for example. Kernza shout out. And then over time, as your trees begin to capture more of that light energy, transitioning your understory to shade tolerant forbs for seed production for wildflowers, for example, or for shade tolerant grasses and running animals through that ecosystem. Perhaps include energy such as solar and wind farms in the mix with your nutrition rather than yield thoughts. Yeah, framing energy and nutrition rather than yield might be an attractive alternative. Yeah, I agree. And we have had somebody recently come to us asking about the possibility of putting a large dock alongside the river, and they're trying to work through these prototypes of turbines that are just catching the flow of the Missouri River and turning that into energy. So that is interesting. Don't know that we're going to go that route. If we do any building on site, we would be trying to tap into like solar energy, for example. Steve Olson, hello. Nice to have you here. Very good presentation. Have you tried to lay out timelines to return for various plantings, maybe legacy improvements on a piece of landscape that is marginal to our current? Yeah, we have timelines for this project. I put together a 5-year strategic plan, which lays out when we are trying to get each of these practices on the ground and when we're trying to get like education and training programs rolled out, as well as infrastructure built and trail systems built. Would be happy to share that. And then one thing that I didn't talk about, but this reminded me, is that the site is going to go underwater. Again, we know that it will go underwater. It went underwater in 2019. All of it except the restaurant and the spot we have for walnuts was underwater. And so everything that we have done out there, we are anticipating that it will be underwater again and trying to do the appropriate design to figure out what works and what doesn't work. And I had my email on there, and I'll include that with follow-up from Ethan and Dana. So I'm happy to connect with anybody outside of this if they are interested to chat about these topics, and hope to see you at the Agroforestry Symposium.
Zach, I have listed here, we want links to cost share opportunities, registration to the couple of workshops you mentioned, info about urban community opportunities, and volunteer opportunities, as well as your email. I hope I captured the things people were putting in the chat and the Q&A as far as follow-up.
Sounds great. Yeah, I'll follow up with you all.
What a great way to kick off the winter learning series. That's really awesome. And like, I hope we continue in the spirit of this so we can keep learning from each other.
Thank you all for having me here. It's really great to be with you guys.
Thanks, everybody. Zach, we will see you at the Fish and Wildlife meeting in St. Louis quite soon.
Okay, sounds
all
good.
right.
Thank
Good
you
night,
all.
everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Good night.